Imagine a king so powerful that Europe trembled at his armies. Yet behind the palace walls, he was crumbling not from battle, not from poison, not even from old age, but from his bed. Yes, history records a monarch who died from too much sex. A king whose desires consumed him, whose nights lasted longer than his days, and whose body, though draped in royal robes, was breaking apart under the weight of his own lust. It sounds like a scandalous legend, yet it is chillingly real. The story of a ruler who exchanged crowns and kingdoms for endless nights of obsession. By the year 1746, courtiers whispered behind golden doors. The King of Spain is dying not from wounds of war, but from pleasure itself. But how could a man crowned by God, armed with armies, and sworn to rule an empire, end up destroyed by the very act meant to create life? Tonight, we dive deep into the unbelievable tale of the king who died from too much sex. Before we begin this scandalous journey through royal chambers, make sure you subscribe to Royal Conspiracies, where we uncover the shocking secrets, forbidden romances, and deadly scandals of history's most powerful rulers. Like, share, and let others discover the story they never dared to teach in school. Our story begins not in Spain, but in France. On December 19, 1683, a child was born in Versailles, Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the great Sun King, Louis XIV. From the very beginning, Philip was frail, nervous, and deeply religious. Unlike his brothers who hunted, fought, and laughed in the gardens of Versailles, Philip seemed delicate. He had bouts of melancholy, sudden fevers, and long hours of silent prayer. But fate had greater plans for this quiet boy. In the year 1700, the Spanish throne stood empty. King Charles II of Spain, the infamous, sickly monarch who left no heirs, had died. And in his will, he shocked Europe by naming Philip of Anjou as his successor. The Spanish Empire was one of the richest in the world, stretching from Madrid to Mexico, from Peru to the Philippines. And now, this nervous, thin French prince was suddenly Philip V of Spain. But no one could have predicted that his greatest weakness would not be politics nor war, but the very passion that burned inside his private chambers. For in Madrid, Philip found himself surrounded by whispers, by temptation, and by women who understood one thing, that the king's greatest power was also his greatest flaw. Philip V was barely 18 when he entered Madrid as Spain's new king in 1701. The Spanish nobility expected a strong ruler, a warrior like his grandfather Louis XIV. Instead, they found a boyish king with restless eyes, trembling hands, and a hunger that could not be satisfied. At first, courtiers whispered that Philip was overly affectionate. He clung to his young wife, Maria Luisa of Savoy, with such intensity that they spent nearly every waking hour together. She was only 13 when they married, a child queen thrown into the arms of a king whose desires were already consuming him. The reports are chillingly consistent. Philip demanded intimacy every night, sometimes multiple times. He would interrupt council meetings, leaving generals waiting, so he could retreat to his chamber with the queen. In 1702, when the War of Spanish Succession broke out, his advisors begged him to focus on battle plans. But Philip, distracted and exhausted, often disappeared behind closed doors. Letters from the French ambassador in Madrid record it bluntly. The king is too much occupied with his young queen. He has no time for state affairs. The obsession became dangerous. Maria Luisa, frail and barely a woman, was forced to match the king's endless appetite. Doctors warned Philip that her health could collapse. But he refused to listen. For Philip, the bedroom was not pleasure, it was compulsion. Some historians call it the earliest recorded case of sex addiction in European royalty. And the palace felt it. When generals marched off to war, their king stayed behind, lost in endless nights of desire. By 1705, Spain was trembling. Armies clashed across Europe. Allies betrayed each other. The throne of Spain itself was at risk of collapse. And yet, the young king's mind was slipping further away, trapped not in war rooms, but in silk sheets and candlelit chambers. The courtiers whispered a phrase that would haunt Philip's reign. "The king is not well. His blood is being drained in bed." By 1705, the War of Spanish Succession raged across Europe, but inside the walls of Madrid's royal palace, another war was being fought. A silent, painful war inside the body of Queen Maria Luisa of Savoy. Still a teenager, Maria Luisa was adored by the Spanish people for her beauty and kindness. But behind the palace doors, she carried the unbearable burden of being the wife of Philip V. Every night, courtiers reported the same routine. The king locked himself in with his queen, refusing audiences, ignoring ministers, obsessing over her as though she were the only thing that existed. He demanded more than her strength could bear. Maria Luisa began to weaken. She lost weight, suffered fainting spells, and struggled with endless exhaustion. The royal doctors whispered that her body was consumed by conjugal duties. In one shocking report from 1706, a physician dared to warn the king, "If His Majesty continues with such excesses, the queen may not live to see the spring." But Philip, trapped in his obsession, could not stop. At times, he seemed terrified that if he did not touch her constantly, he would lose her love. He followed her everywhere, into gardens, into chapels, even into her dressing rooms. It was not love anymore. It was possession. By 1712, tragedy struck. Maria Luisa, only 26 years old, fell gravely ill. Her frail body could no longer withstand the endless demands of her royal husband. When she died that year, courtiers did not dare speak the truth aloud. But many believed it. The young queen had been drained to death by the king's unrelenting passion. Philip collapsed in despair. He locked himself away for days, crying uncontrollably, refusing food, as if he had not only lost a queen, but the very obsession that gave his life meaning. But grief did not cure his desires. Instead, it made them darker. Because soon, another woman would enter the palace. One who would not only fuel his appetites, but use them to control the throne of Spain itself. And with her arrival, Philip's descent into madness and obsession would become unstoppable. The year was 1714. Spain was broken from years of war. Its treasury drained, its armies exhausted, its people starving. But the most unstable part of the empire sat on the throne itself. King Philip V. His young queen Maria Luisa was dead, and Philip spiraled into depression and hysteria. He wailed in the palace halls, refused to bathe, and at times claimed he was being tormented by demons. The king who could not control his desires now could not control his mind. Spain desperately needed stability, and stability came in the form of a clever, ambitious Italian woman, Elizabeth Farnese of Parma. Elizabeth was no child bride. She was 22 years old, a widow, strong-willed, and politically shrewd. When she married Philip in December 1714, the Spanish court expected another fragile queen to be consumed by his appetite. But Elizabeth was different. She quickly realized the truth. The king's lust, which had destroyed his first queen, could be turned into a weapon, a leash around the neck of Spain's most powerful man. At night, she gave Philip exactly what he craved: endless intimacy, unwavering attention, a performance of devotion that seemed bottomless. By day, she whispered commands into his ear, using his exhaustion and obsession to bend him to her will. Within months, Elizabeth had taken control of the Spanish court. She dismissed old ministers, banished ladies-in-waiting who opposed her, and filled the palace with her Italian allies. Courtiers were stunned. One chronicler wrote in 1715, "The queen has bewitched His Majesty. He obeys her not as a husband obeys a wife, but as a servant obeys a master." And it was true. Philip was no longer ruling Spain. Elizabeth was. But her dominance came at a cost. Philip's compulsions grew darker. His mood swung wildly between manic energy and crushing despair. He sometimes refused to change his clothes for weeks, claiming his skin was covered in flames. Other times, he locked himself in bed for days, demanding Elizabeth never leave his side. The palace was becoming a prison, not just for the king, but for all of Spain. And as Europe watched, the whispers spread further. The King of Spain is losing his mind, driven mad by lust and ruled by a woman who knows his every weakness. By 1717, Spain stood on the edge of chaos. Philip's health was crumbling. His body shook, his voice broke, and his ministers began to wonder if the king would even live to see the decade's end. But they did not yet know. Philip would live on, consumed by obsession, dragging Spain with him through decades of scandal, despair, and ruin. By 1717, Madrid's royal palace had turned into something strange. Part throne room, part madhouse, and part prison of lust. King Philip V, now in his 30s, was no longer just a ruler with a weakness. He had become a man enslaved by ritual. Every night, without fail, he demanded intimacy from Queen Elizabeth Farnese, not as an act of love, but as a compulsion so consuming that he could not sleep without it. Courtiers recorded that if Elizabeth refused, Philip would scream, cry, and thrash like a child, sometimes collapsing into seizures of despair. It was more than lust. It was obsession. Philip required Elizabeth to remain with him at nearly all hours. She could not leave his chamber, not even for meals or prayers, without risking a violent outburst from the king. At times, ministers were forced to stand outside the royal bedroom and wait while their monarch finished his nightly business. Matters of war and empire were delayed because the king was trapped in his own bed. One diplomat in 1718 wrote bitterly, "Spain is governed not in council, but between sheets." But the rituals went further. Philip developed grotesque habits. He refused to cut his nails, sometimes would not change clothes for weeks, and often muttered prayers even in the middle of intimacy, as if trying to purify his desires while drowning in them. His body began to break under the strain. He grew pale, feverish, and exhausted. Doctors warned his heart could not endure the endless exertions. But Philip ignored them, insisting he would rather die in his queen's arms than live without her. By 1724, his madness reached a peak. Philip shocked Europe by suddenly abdicating the throne, handing the crown to his son Louis. He claimed he was too sick, too broken, to rule. But behind palace doors, courtiers knew the truth. The king could no longer handle the pressures of government, because his nights had destroyed his days. Spain had a monarch who ruled from his bed, and it nearly cost him his kingdom. Yet fate was cruel. Louis died only months later, and Philip was dragged back to the throne, a sick, lust-consumed man forced to rule again. And now his decline would accelerate. For Philip's obsession was not fading. It was growing darker, heavier, and soon it would bring whispers of death. By 1724, Philip V was back on the throne. But he was no longer just a king obsessed. He was a king unraveling. His compulsions grew unbearable. He demanded nightly satisfaction from Elizabeth, sometimes several times, even when his body trembled from exhaustion. Doctors warned, "His Majesty is destroying himself." But worse than the lust was the madness it fed. Philip began muttering that demons stalked his chambers. He refused to touch his clothes for days, fearing they burned with hellfire. He shouted prayers in the middle of the night, then collapsed into his queen's arms, begging her never to leave his side. Courtiers whispered in horror, "The king is possessed, by lust, by madness, or by both." Spain, once mighty, now had a monarch who ruled from his bed, a prisoner of his own body. And still he lived on, broken but not yet dead. The king's obsession would drag him deeper, toward a fate whispered of in every palace hall. A death born not of battle or poison, but of desire itself. By the 1730s, Spain was not ruled by its king. It was ruled by its queen. Elizabeth Farnese had mastered the art of control. She satisfied Philip's nightly obsessions, and in return he granted her absolute authority over court and council. Ministers came not to Philip, but to Elizabeth, the woman who whispered in the king's ear when he was too weak to rise from bed. Philip, pale and trembling, rarely appeared in public. But Elizabeth was everywhere, negotiating alliances, reshaping Spain's armies, and pushing her children into powerful European marriages. The courtiers had no illusions. Spain's throne rested on a fragile man, but its true power lay in the queen's hands. Yet Philip's body was collapsing. His voice cracked, his hands shook, and still, the nightly rituals continued. The whispers grew darker. The king is dying from too much passion, but the queen will rule on. By the mid-1730s, the Spanish court had grown used to whispers. They had grown used to a king who rarely appeared in council, who trembled in public, who clung to his queen as though she were his lifeline. But now, a new horror spread through the palace halls. The King of Spain could not sleep. Philip V's obsession with nightly pleasures had drained him for decades. But by 1737, his body was so broken that rest became impossible. Some nights, he would pace his chambers for hours, muttering prayers and clutching at his chest, before turning suddenly and desperately toward Elizabeth. If he could not sleep, he demanded intimacy, again and again, until dawn broke over Madrid. The queen, though exhausted, dared not refuse. For when she tried, Philip would collapse into hysterics, screaming that demons were dragging him into hell, or that he would die on the spot if she abandoned him. Doctors were summoned night after night. They prescribed tonics of wine and herbs, leeches for his head, even bleeding treatments to cool the blood. But nothing worked. The king's eyes grew hollow, his skin pale, his once thin body now skeletal from exhaustion. Courtiers described haunting scenes. One wrote in 1738, "The king has become a shadow. At night he cries and clings to the queen like a frightened child. At day he stares blankly, refusing to dress or wash. He is a prisoner to his lust and his terrors." In council, ministers spoke of war, finance, treaties, but Philip often sat silent, trembling, sometimes nodding off from sheer fatigue, only to wake at night and begin the cycle again. Spain's greatest enemies across Europe began to sense the weakness. Here was an empire of silver and gold, yet its king was wasting away in bed. By 1740, the palace was alive with a single, chilling rumor. The king is killing himself slowly. He will not die of age or battle, but of sleepless nights and too much pleasure. And yet he endured, fragile, trembling, sleepless, but still clinging to life. The courtiers began to wonder, how long could a man survive, when his body had been consumed for nearly 40 years by desire? By the early 1740s, the damage was visible. Philip V no longer looked like a king. He looked like a corpse still walking. His skin turned yellow and waxy, his teeth blackened, his hands shook so violently he could not hold a pen. Courtiers whispered he smelled of sickness, a stench of sweat and rot that clung to his chambers. And still, the nightly rituals continued. Elizabeth, trapped by duty and power, fed the king's obsession even as it drained the last of his strength. One courtier wrote in 1743, "It is not war that will take him, nor poison, nor age. It is the fire of his own desires, which has burned him from the inside." Spain watched in horror. Their king was slowly dying, but not with honor. With shamed up by 1744, Philip V was barely alive. He spent nearly all his time in bed, sweating, trembling, and begging Elizabeth never to leave his side. The nightly demands did not stop. Even as his heart weakened and his breath grew shallow, the king clung to the same compulsions that had consumed him for decades. On July 9, 1746, the inevitable came. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, collapsed in his chamber at the age of 62. Doctors recorded the cause as fever and weakness. But in hushed voices, the courtiers said what everyone already knew. The King of Spain has died from his desires. When King Philip V died in the summer of 1746, Spain buried him in the royal palace of La Granja, beneath marble, gold, and the prayers of the church. But no amount of incense or holy words could mask the truth whispered across Europe. Spain's king had been consumed not by war, not by treachery, but by his own unquenchable desires. In life, Philip had been crowned as the ruler of one of the richest empires in the world. He inherited lands from the Americas to Asia, a legacy of gold, silver, and power unmatched by most kings of his age. And yet, history does not remember him for victories or reforms. It remembers the shadows of his bedchamber. Chroniclers of his time wrote without mercy. They described a monarch who ignored counsels of war for moments of passion, a king whose sleepless nights weakened his body, whose endless appetite destroyed his queens, and whose throne became a prison of lust and madness. Even the church, which often shielded kings from scandal, could not deny the truth. Priests who had heard his confessions whispered that Philip was a man possessed, a ruler who prayed for salvation one moment, then drowned in obsession the next. Elizabeth Farnese, his second queen, emerged from his death as the true victor. For decades she had ruled through him, using his weakness as her strength. She secured marriages for her children, political power for her family, and a legacy that stretched across Europe. But even she could not erase the shame that clung to her husband's name. In taverns, in salons, in palaces, people repeated the same mocking tale. Spain's great Bourbon king did not die by sword or crown. He died in his bed, undone by his lust. And so Philip V entered history not as a conqueror, not as a statesman, but as a warning of how power means nothing if a man cannot control himself, a warning of how kings, despite their crowns, are still prisoners of their flesh. Centuries later, historians still debate the details. Was it truly lust that killed him? Was it madness, depression, or an undiagnosed illness? The records blur fact with scandal, but one truth remains clear. Philip V was a king whose reign was shaped not in war rooms, but in bedchambers. His story stands as one of the strangest, most haunting legacies in royal history. The king who died from too much sex. And that is the shocking, tragic tale of Philip V of Spain, a ruler who could command armies but not himself. If you enjoyed uncovering this forbidden chapter of history, make sure to subscribe to Royal Conspiracies, where we bring you the untold scandals, betrayals, and dark secrets of the world's most powerful rulers. Don't forget to like and share. And join us next time for another story history tried to bury.